please welcome, to speak about the international scale of Scotch and its role in marketing Scotland as a global brand. Please welcome Glen Gribbon, the CEO of Bladnoch Distillers and the non-exec chair of the Cabrach Distillery.
I should probably start by explaining that you're about to see lots of Macallan imagery and content, but I don't actually work there anymore. 6 weeks ago, I honestly did. I was the marketing director for 7.5 years before realising that if I didn't do something different, I would literally be wheeled out the building in a few years to come. And the something different is that I'm now the chief exec of a distillery that's actually in the far south of Scotland, in Dumfries and Galloway, near the village of Wigtown, called Bladnoch. And in fact, if you draw a line across the country, the distillery is actually further south than Newcastle. So an area where there aren't a lot of whisky distilleries. So the talk today caught somewhere in between the transition from one whisky company to another. And I should just, as a brief aside, my daughter Katie, who Dave kindly gave some work experience to, sent me a helpful, at least I think it was meant to be helpful, email yesterday. We put a press release out last week about, my switch to Bladnoch, and she'd been in Google and put my name in, gone to Google News, and sent me an email saying there was 9 headlines, one of which was that Randy Arnold had been appointed the principal of Gribbon Elementary School in upscale New York. So she was suggesting that perhaps my profile wasn't quite what it should be if I was having to share my big news day with Randy Arnold, although Randy and I are now connected through LinkedIn. So I'm going to talk, well, first of all, thanks to the Advertising Association and Brian for the invite to come along today and talk about something that certainly I think is very important, and that is why Scotch whisky really matters. Matters to Scotland, but matters to the UK, but perhaps as importantly, given where we are today, matters to us as a marketing community. And I'm going to focus on 4 reasons why Scotch matters, and obviously I'm kind of implying it should matter more. The scale of the industry, its success over the last 10 years, and its impact. Secondly, as a source of high-value tourism into Scotland, a vehicle that promotes Scotland, the brand, a vehicle for community regeneration, and I should perhaps have added inspiration for naming your child as a final reason. There is a very good story, by the way, about a collector who bought a bottle of Macallan 18 every single year for 20 years and then sold it all and bought his son a house. So there's maybe a little bit of inspiration. So I'll start. I don't have lots of kind of busy slides, but this one's quite important because it does talk to the scale of Scotch whisky. So in 2022, Scotch exports, and only exports, grew by 37% to 6.2 billion. I'll come back to that figure of 6.2 billion because it actually is very relevant to us as a marketing community. There's 146 operating distilleries across Scotland. There's 11,000 people that are employed directly by the Scotch whisky industry. Now, 7,000 of those jobs are in remote rural areas, and I'll come back to that point because it's actually quite important. There's about 42,000 jobs that are dependent on the industry, although not directly employed. So it's a big global industry, and the brands that have driven the growth in Scotch whisky, and I would include Macallan, Johnnie Walker, Chivas, are genuinely amongst the true believers in marketing. The kind of common metric in the industry is that a premium whisky brand should be investing at least 20% of net sales in marketing. Now, if you consider that figure of 6.2 billion of export sales, that hopefully kind of starts to give a sense of why, as an industry, it's very important in terms of marketing. For Macallan, one of our top 3 agencies, I keep talking in the present tense, one of our top 3 agencies was the Leith Agency. You've just seen the film that we shot with the support of Dave and Leith at the estate. So even Macallan has been a kind of big supporter of the industry here in Scotland. Now, if you look at the this on your right-hand side is the top whisky markets in the world by volume, and then on your left-hand side is the top whisky markets by value. Now, I think if I'd probably asked you at the beginning to say what are the top markets, I'm pretty sure you wouldn't have come up with this list. So India is actually the #1 volume market for Scotch whisky. Now, last year, the equivalent of 72 million bottles of Scotch was imported into India, and that's despite a very aggressive 150% tariff that's applied to every case of Scotch whisky that lands in India. Now, our industry body, and we do have a very effective industry body called the SWA, are working hard in the current round of trade talks to see that reduced. And if they do, the potential for India over the next 10 years for Scotch whisky is colossal. So India is #1, US is the #1 market for value. And I guess the one market that is missing from either list is the UK. And I think that makes it all the more perplexing why the UK government in the spring budget of this year actually reversing what was a manifesto pledge, applied another 10.1% tax on a bottle of Scotch, which means that if you buy a bottle of, let's say it's Famous Grouse, in a supermarket, 75% of what you pay is actually tax. So it's very, very highly taxed. And I think all too often the reward for the success of Scotch whisky has been either more tax or more regulation, as we've recently seen with moves, thankfully, on the back burner now by the Scottish Government in terms of marketing regulation that restricts our ability to engage with our consumers. Now, if you've got a kind of traditional view of Scotch, which is, Christmas time, gondola ends, bottles of whisky for £25, it couldn't be more different than the reality today. Now, every spirits category has kind of benefited from premiumisation, but none more than Scotch. And Macallan, as a single malt brand, has really led the creation of a category which is called ultra prestige. And that's bottles of whisky at over $5,000 a bottle, where Macallan absolutely dominates. In fact, only real competition is with cognac brands. This is called the Red Collection. It's the high age, so ranging from 40-year-old whisky to 78-year-old whisky. To put this in context, we launched a limited edition version of this, a 77-year-old product with a recommended retail price of $87,000 per bottle. Now, what this means is that Scotch whisky is almost driving the creation within Scotland of not just about the success of Scotch, but actually helping drive the creation of Scottish luxury, of a category of Scottish luxury. That in time, there's no reason that couldn't sit comfortably alongside Italian, French luxury, albeit defined by different values. Now, this brand is owned by Edrington, and again, I'm guessing it's primarily a Scottish audience. Edrington is a Glasgow-based company, private company, and all of the functions that are required to successfully run a global Scotch business are run from Glasgow at 100 Queen Street. Now, in the last financial year, Edrington's last financial year, which ended in March of 2023, for the first time the business went through the £1 million revenue barrier and made £367 million of pre-tax profits. Now, that in itself is interesting, but the main shareholder of Edrington is the Robertson Trust, and the Robertson Trust is the largest grant-giving charity in Scotland. So what happens is Edrington makes the money, a dividend is paid to the Robertson Trust, and they then distribute that profit across a range of exclusively Scottish charities that are mainly focused on the alleviation of poverty and trauma. And in fact, the Robertson Trust have distributed £453 million already to Scottish charities. So, if that isn't a reason, if Edrington alone isn't a reason why Scotch whisky should matter more, especially to the Scottish Government, then I'm not sure what is. Tourism. Pre-pandemic, so 2019, 2.26 million visitors came to the 70 distillery experiences that exist across the country. And you know, the days when it was coach loads of, my apologies to pensioners, coach loads of pensioners who would have a scone, a cup of tea and buy a miniature are kind of long gone, because these visitors are high value tourists from primarily Asia and North America, who have got a real deep connection with Scotch whisky and with the brands that they want to visit. I kind of hope that you've been to the Johnnie Walker Experience. 300,000 people visited the Johnnie Walker Experience in its first year of being open. At the other end of the spectrum, in terms of scale, you've got the Glen Distillery, which is based outside of Crieff. And they have a restaurant called the Lalique Restaurant, which is the first whisky restaurant to achieve a Michelin star. Now, at the top of the pile, I obviously think is Macallan. Now, the Macallan Distillery and Visitor Experience was opened back in 2018, and it was a 140 million investment. And that's an important point, because, you know, whisky companies are investing a huge amount of money in essentially tourist infrastructure in Scotland to drive 2.26 million people to visit those experiences. So this was a 140 million investment. It was never really about making money. It was about ensuring that we were driving engagement and advocacy amongst our very best consumers. And although profitability did matter, because you are selling bottles of whisky at $87,000 a bottle, actually the real metric that we used to measure whether or not the team were doing a good job was this concept of return on experience. And if you haven't been to Macallan, just a kind of few pictures to bring it to life. On your right hand side is about a third of the visitor experience. That's the bar at the top. Beautiful wooden undulating roof inside. And then to your left is a fully functioning operating distillery that's capable of making 16 million litres of alcohol a year. It's one of the largest single malt distilleries in the country. But you're almost touching the production process, which I just think is a lovely concept. Outside, the distillery looks as if it's underground. It's got this grass, wild grass, undulating roof. No easy task to get wild grass, as we found for 5 years, to grow on top of the roof of a distillery that is producing huge amounts of heat every day. And then just finally, this is what's called the cut, when you walk from the distillery itself down towards Easter Elke's house, which was the original estate house, the kind of spiritual home of Macallan, and features in all of our kind of packaging. So, Scotch is increasingly a kind of driver of high value tourism. And then the third reason is that, and this was touched on earlier, Scotch whisky is actually a great promoter of Scotland, the brand, through the content that Scotch whisky brands are creating. And I've got a couple of Macallan examples to show you. This is one of my favourite campaigns from the last 7 or so years. It's for Fine and Rare, which is the largest assembly of vintage dated whiskies in the world. And there's actually 60 releases. And the film, the Macallan film, and thank you, whoever brought that Macallan film, thank you, because I don't have any videos. You'll see that it spoke about a bottle, a 1926 Fine and Rare. Now, that was a bottle of whisky that was actually filled into cask in 1926. And when you think about what was happening in the world back in 1926, it's incredible to own that bottle. Unfortunately, to own it, you would have had to pay more than the 1.9 million that somebody paid at a Sotheby's auction in 2019. So when we think about kind of aspiration, you know, this is one of the best examples, but it's a great shot. It was taken by Tim Walker, kind of well-known fashion photographer, and it features the Craigellachie Bridge, which was designed and built back in, between 1812 and 1814 by Thomas Telford. And the bridge itself actually played a really important role in the early development of Scotch whisky, because distilleries like Macallan that were on the right-hand side were finally able to get whisky across the river to the trains that were on the other side that would take the whisky down to the big markets that were in England at the time. Now, you know, I think it does I think it's a great campaign for Macallan, but I think it's also a great campaign for Speyside, in this particular part of Speyside. And if you come to Craigellachie and walk onto that bridge in the summer, you will see hundreds of people when the, when the water level is low, standing at this point, getting their picture taken with the bridge as a backdrop. Another example is a collaboration with Sir Peter Blake, who is a kind of long-standing friend of the brand, and we created a range of whiskies, each of them featuring a particular aspect of the Macallan estate, and this one the obligatory Hailing Coup, but using his unique pop art style. There was a whole range of products, and what I love about this is in itself it's actually a marketing campaign for one particular part of Speyside. Now, if you consider hundreds of Scotch whisky brands that are all using different elements of Scotland in their content in a very progressive and a very modern way, I think you've got one of the most powerful tourist marketing campaigns in the world. So Scotch whisky does define how Scotland as a brand is seen around the world. And then finally, and I did kind of sneak this one in, but it's a really, I think it's a really good story. Alongside my Bladnoch role, I'm also a kind of non-exec director of the Cabrach Distillery. Now, the Cabrach area is, if you know Scotland or the north of Scotland, and one person will, it sits between Dufftown and Ballater. It's a very, very remote area. But back in the day, it used to be very well known for illegal whisky making. So 200 years ago, before whisky distilleries were actually legalised, there's all sorts of references to Cabrach whisky being the best illegal whisky that you can buy. Now, why the distillery matters is it's actually set up, and I'll just let these run through to let you see what the distillery will ultimately look like. The purpose of the distillery is to regenerate an area that, after whisky was made legal 200 years ago, really went into decline, and it's never really recovered from that. So it's set up as what's called a community interest company, and that's a legal status that means that when it starts to make profits, the profits from the distillery have to be reinvested back into the regeneration of the community. It's actually the first distillery in Scotland that has that status, and remember, it will be operating from 2023. The money to build it has all come through donations, whether that's through individual trusts, whether it's through companies, or through Scottish Government funding, and we are grateful for the Scottish Government. There's some just transition funding that really has helped. And it's one of the things that we forget about distilleries. And remember, 11,000 people employed by Scotch directly, 7,000 people in rural areas. It's one of the few businesses that can actually bring high-value jobs and tourism to remote parts of Scotland. So it plays a really important role in doing that. So that's the Cabrach Distillery, open from spring 2023. It's a tiny distillery, by the way. 100,000 litres of alcohol is the maximum production. And remember, Macallan was 16 million. So you're talking about two very different scales. And I'll end with this. I'll perhaps key messages, and then I'll tell you why I'm showing you a picture of Bladnoch Distillery. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that Scotch whisky doesn't matter enough to the Scottish Government, it doesn't matter enough to the UK Government, and it should probably matter more to us because it is a fantastic success story in Scotland. Remember, 6.2 billion of export sales and an industry that wants to invest 20% of that in marketing. It's a great driver of tourism into Scotland. It continues to thrive. It's a real global industry. It is a rejuvenator of rural communities, and it's a great promoter of Scotland, the brand. And when you see images like this, and this is the Bladnoch Distillery, so I thought I would end on Bladnoch for no other reason than I would love you to visit. It's only 3 hours south from Glasgow, but a beautiful drive. I think you actually all get my email, but if any of you do want to visit, do send me an email and I'll make sure that the team down there give you a fantastic welcome and let you try some of the amazing whiskies that Dr. Nick Savage, who's the master distiller, is making, and I guarantee you a very warm welcome down in Dunfreeson, Galloway. So, hopefully there's still some time for questions, if there are any. I'm conscious. No, there isn't time for any questions. So thank you for listening.